it is not on me. This is the work of the Holy Spirit, that God is working in ways that I cannot see and cannot understand, but he has called me to do my part. I think it's really helpful to think about the idea of like an orchestra. Some people just play the violin. It doesn't sound the same if it's just this one person, or if I'm a violinist and I'm trying to be a cellist. Play your instrument, what God called you to do. And so if that is to be the person that goes to every school board meeting and is always like, hey, what about the kids in Title I schools? Girl, you're playing your instrument.
Welcome back to The Disruptors, a podcast from InterVarsity Press. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Schiess. Today, I'm talking to my friend Kathryn Freeman about the relationship between politics and theology, what she's learned in her years of working both with elected officials and in local churches, and the witness of the Black church in American political life. Kathryn offers us both practical suggestions and a theological vision for faithful Christian witness in public. Kathryn Freeman is a PhD student at Baylor University, studying virtue, ecclesiology, diversity, and democracy. She previously worked as the Director of Public Policy for the Baptist General Convention of Texas and for several public policy nonprofits on issues affecting low-income families, such as juvenile justice reform, maternal health, and the school-to-prison pipeline. Kathryn has an MDiv from Truett Seminary, a JD from the University of Texas Law School, and a BA from Texas A&M University. I know you'll enjoy learning from Kathryn's vast experience and education. She's done her homework. She also has a heart for equipping churches and Christians to faithful discipleship. I'm really excited about this, and I really want to start out asking you a little bit about your background because it's so interesting to me. And before we get into some of the other topics, I think it would be helpful for people to hear about where you're coming from because you have done a lot of things. You have a lot of education and have done a lot of work.
I do.
So tell us just a little bit about your story when it comes to faith and politics and kind of your educational background, but also kind of where you've come to the place you are now with your sense of vocation.
Yeah, so I guess I would say it started maybe in college, maybe a little bit earlier than that. My mom was like, and my grandfather were like vociferous, like news watchers and like just always like very interested in politics. So it kind of like grew up around that conversation. But I think for me, where my like sense of vocation really originates from is in college, I mentored, was part of through my church, a ministry that worked with kids in the local high school, Bryan ISD, which if you're familiar with like where Texas A&M is, like College Station is a little bit more affluent and Bryan is a little bit more working class. And so we would pick up students at our church and like bring them back for like youth group. And we would have like a homework probably hour, and then we would do like games and fun stuff with them. And just but like through that work of like just seeing like these two cities are like right next to each other and the like depth of inequity in terms of what resources were available. Like particularly I mentored a girl whose name was Aisha, and I tell her story a lot because it was just really eye-opening for me. You know, I think a lot of the things that Christians are told about poverty, it's like people need to work, or this is because people don't have fathers, and that was not the case with her family. Like her parents were married, like extremely hardworking, had been married since like, I think they were high school sweethearts, and had this desire to go to college. Like she really wanted to be the first person in her family to go to college. And so my roommate and I were like, okay, we'll tutor you in the SAT, like, you know, to get ready to do that. Like her school didn't have any offer and her parents, you know, they had no idea. And so we sit down on the first day and I thought, like, we're going to start with something easy because this is her first time. I like want to build her confidence. At that time, I know the SAT has changed, so I'm dating myself a little bit, but you had those like word analogies. So like it was that portion where you had like one word and then what is an analogous word. So like studying vocabulary was very helpful for that section. And so we started out with like the vocab flashcards and I show her the first word and she's just giving me a total blank stare. And then I like use it in a sentence and she's still not really sure. And at this point, my heart drops because she's so smart. She's an A student. Like she cares a lot about school. She always did her homework. And, you know, she was like a senior. And I was like, how is it possible? Like, I feel like this is a word that maybe I learned in like 7th or 8th grade. And And I felt so bad because it was having the opposite effect of like, instead of building her confidence, she was like starting to feel really bad. And the word was denial. And it opened my whole world to this idea that like, just because of someone's zip code, we all accept, as a taxpayer, as someone who lived and voted in Bryan, that it was okay, this sort of educational inequity. And so that really kind of started my journey around policy and how schools are funded. And I went to law school and worked for state senator to do education policy. God had other plans. I ended up doing communications, but post that, working in politics, I have done more like policy work, both in my 2 previous jobs with a nonprofit policy organization and then also working with Texas Baptist. And I think my sense of calling is just motivated out of this deep sense of like justice. And I know that there are like different ways of going about that. And I just felt, for me, like were so many Aishas in the world. And, what's the best route to go about them? And I have experience, I always say like advocacy and like community work. So like tutoring her was a way of like doing advocacy. But I think for me, just feeling like on a systemic level, like I can do this person by person, which, we all have our limits, or I can get to the like, or be the type of person that like gets to like the root of the issue. And I think I just have always felt like a deep sense of calling to like go upstream and deal upstream with the issues. And I feel like that's like a through thread of even where I am now vocationally.
Yeah. What prompted seminary for you? Because I think I mostly encounter people who go the opposite direction. They go to seminary because they want to do ministry. They get confronted at some point with some systemic issues, and they either go to law school after that, or they end up working for a nonprofit after that. But I don't meet a lot of people that take the direction that you took. So what kind of prompted that decision?
So part of it is I laugh because, and I like tell the story because I have a sense of humor about it now. And I feel like it's part of my story, and God can use anything, any motivation. So I went to law school, honestly, because I did not want to work, and my parents would not pay for me to get a master's degree in English. And I'm not a math person, so I didn't want to do business school. And I honestly, at the time, just didn't think seminary was an option. I grew up in a church where women were not pastors and didn't have like lead ministry roles. That's changed a little bit since I grew up, but it honestly just never occurred to me. But I loved politics. I loved public policy. And so that's why I chose law school. And then I think in my turn, I never thought about the kind of conjunction of being able to, in a single job, do my 2 deepest, like my love of Jesus and love of neighbor, and also combine that with my love of like justice and public policy. And I worked for Texas Baptist, and, I'm like, I love to read, and like was reading a lot of books. And I just kind of was like, well, I want to know for myself. Like, I want to be able to, for myself, have the skills and the tools to like read and kind of come to my own conclusions was one thing. But my other thing was like, I want to see what kind of training most pastors get. My like sort of practical experience. I want to be in the space where most pastors are trained to understand how ministry leaders are trained to kind of have these conversations. And the answer was they are not. Which just kind of like clarified a lot of things for me. But then I think also too, just for myself, like understanding like church history and like what is, the historical through line of the church in terms of how they've engaged with governments and, and then thinking theologically about what that might look like. And then the hope of sort of, changing that at some point in the future, where there could be more conversations around discipleship and spiritual formation that involve public life and politics and what it means to be sort of outside the walls of the church.
Yeah, I was curious, even hearing you say that just now, when you said, I was curious how pastors were trained. I was like, not at all. Definitely not. But I am curious, like when you were doing the work you were doing before, and when I first met you, it was in the context of Texas Baptist. So you were working with churches, working with people in churches, thinking about policy and advocacy. Were there things that when you went to seminary sort of surprised you theologically, or that confirmed what you'd been doing? Because I imagine in the work you were working out a theology of politics, just kind of on the ground. Were there things that either you learned and thought, Oh, yeah, I kind of figured that out along the way. I hadn't learned it in this formal sense, but it's what I had figured out as I was working. Or were there things that kind of challenged what you had been doing, or even things that you heard being taught that you were like, oh, maybe that's part of the reason I'm encountering these pastors that aren't well trained for this is actually this idea that I think might be wrong?
Yeah, I think in terms of like challenging me, I think because I am African American, come out of the African American church tradition, the idea that it's possible to be political without ever kind of engaging elected officials was like very challenging to me,
Yeah.
particularly in the early church. You know, we think about like Christians who were persecuted under like the Roman Empire and subsequent generations. You think about the Anabaptists. So that was challenging to me. And I feel like in my experience where I went to seminary, those sort of stories, it did challenge me to think more broadly about the issue of politics and political theology. But it also confirmed to me that in terms of like the weighting of those stories, it felt like the sort of predominant vision that was espoused was this sort of like, well, just love your neighbor and you don't have to kind of go to this like next level in terms
Yeah.
of loving your neighbor. So then it made sense to me why so many pastors either don't talk about politics or are very like cagey about it. This idea that like, love your neighbor encompasses all the things you need to know. And that like, and it does encompass a lot, but in
Yeah.
terms of like practical, and if you preach sermons about that it is automatically translatable into how people engage in politics and their neighbors. To me, that was a little bit like naive, but it was good for me to be challenged in that way because it opened my own thinking about, yeah, like what does it mean to be an advocate? What does it mean to be involved in politics? So
Yeah, no, that matches my experience too. And even my first semester of seminary was during the 2016 election. And it did feel like a lot of my peers were reckoning with the fact that they hadn't been given any resources for responding to this because they saw that it couldn't be separated. Like you said, they were preaching, love your neighbor as yourself. And then they were watching their congregations act in political ways in their communities that did not
yeah.
seem consonant with loving their neighbor. So they went, okay, I have to find some other way to articulate this, but I don't know what it is. And now years since then, I really care with you about us having more robust theology in our churches about what our public life looks like. And the pushback I often get from people is this really deeply ingrained sense in predominantly white churches that we should keep politics out of the pulpit. And when they say pulpit, they don't even just mean actually pulpit. They mean like in the whole walls of the church. Like nothing political should kind of be in the walls of the church, even though there are a lot of unspoken political assumptions and biases that we can just kind of harbor without them being confronted. When you think about the work that you've done with churches and with people in churches, how would you describe a healthy involvement for the church in public life? Because on one hand, I think some people have just this bad theology that doesn't acknowledge the fact that we need to really work out what our public life looks like. On the other hand, I think you have some, especially kind of young evangelical folks who are thinking, well, the model I was given for political engagement is really coercive and unhealthy and power hungry. And so then they just kind of go, I think we just shouldn't have anything to do with it at all. How would you describe, both kind of practically and theologically, what it would look like for people in their churches to be engaged politically?
Yeah. I'm going to try to like make this succinct. I have such a long answer to this.
Go for all you want to say, Kathryn.
I would say the first thing is that we are embodied human beings, and part of being a Christian is living in public. Like none of us live in the church walls. And so if the only place you understand the fruits of the Spirit is within the walls of the Ford Church, and you're not dealing with the totality of what it means to be a person, to be an American, to live in this world and beyond sort of that sort of very sheltered, confined space is what I would say to people that say we don't want to engage this. And the thing is, I think you don't want to engage this, but people are engaged and they are being formed because again, this is part of what it means to be a human being. It's part of what it means to live in your neighborhood, in your state, in this country. And so if you're not forming them or even like influencing their formation, other things are going to step into that vacuum. And I think what we have discovered is that maybe the kinds of formation that are happening, we don't necessarily agree with, or we don't think reflect, the church or our theological commitments. And part of that is because we've abdicated our authority in that space. And I would say to someone who feels like, they just want to give it all up. I mean, I said I'm from the Black church tradition. That's just like not consistent with what I have seen. I want to be clear that the Black church tradition is varied. So there are some churches that were not very political. But when you think about things like the civil rights movement or even beyond that, just like education, like the fight for equality in education. I mean, the family, they weren't named in the Brown versus Board suit, but their children were part of that original suit. He was like a deacon and she was like a Sunday school teacher. And I think of women like, September Clark that both really cared about adult literacy and so ran from her church like literacy education for adults and for children, but also with the goal that like you be able to pass the literacy test so you can vote. I think people have this very limited imagination of what it looks like to be political. It's like, I have to vote. But I think it's so much bigger than that. And like, if that's the only, you should as an American citizen and as a participant in democracy. But if that's the only thing you're doing and you're only talking about politics, in November, October of an election year, I would also argue that that's like not enough. And like, you should not do that. Like the conversation should be ongoing about, what does it mean to live as a Christian? And I feel like a lot of churches maybe do well, like small, like from missions, they have, GED classes or job training and, those things are great. Like you absolutely should do those things. But then when you think about, I'll use like immigration as an example because I do a lot of immigration advocacy work. What we have found is that churches that are very committed to their mission to refugees or immigrants, you reach a point in a person's story where being a neighbor involves more than just, let me take you to the grocery store or help you enroll your kids in school. There just comes a point when you're in relationship with someone, you start to see, that this is not just like, oh, I can just go, to this one office and help you with this one thing and then it's resolved. That things do involve you have to, whether it's, you have a dreamer in your youth group, right? Like your church can fundraise to pay for them to get DACA status, which is great. And you should do that. But at some point it's like, this is a bigger issue that there are, thousands of kids who love Jesus that are caught up in just a really messed up system. And so part of what it might mean to be a good neighbor is, yes, pay for, help pay for a lawyer or, help them apply for college. But also, hey, I'm writing my congressman to tell this story and say, I really care about this issue. But I would say, don't stop at that. There's so many different things you can do. But I would say for me, like in terms of the healthiest ways and models that I've seen, I think it starts with people. I had a conversation many, many years ago with Karen Swallow Pryor, who I know you love, about, well, why can't people just see, like watching on the news, like that these things are happening and why does it require a relationship? Because it seems like that takes a long time. Like you have to be willing to risk things. You have to have some courage to put yourself in situations that you wouldn't normally be in. And that just seems like a lot of factors. And then she reminded me that Jesus was incarnational, that part of what we see in his model and his choosing to come and become human is he has a different level. Like he understands because he was with us. And so that the model that we have in incarnational really is a relationship-based model. And so I often say, I think it's best to start with missions or the people that you know in your church that you're in relationship with. And don't avoid like hard and messy conversations. And I really think the healthiest models I've seen have been built from that. Because I feel like it's hard for a lot of people, my experience is it's hard for a lot of people to just, call up a congressman and be like, I support this, But if you're telling a story of someone you live in a relationship with, in some ways it's much easier because you're not like, I'm not an expert. I don't know, but I want to tell you this story and how it's impacted me and that there's power in that. And honestly, now I think for Christians, sort of for the long-term engagement and a hope-filled sort of political practice, relationship keeps you going. Because so often I've seen it can become just like an intellectual exercise, and it's draining because you don't see any progress. You're like, I'm wasting my time. But when you're tethered to someone, you have like, I don't know, for me, like an additional, like, this isn't about me, and I'm not about politics, and I'm not about the process. I'm about my friend Aisha. I'm about my friend. And that to me is just a better, it just, I feel like sustains you for much, much longer than just like an intellectual, like, I'm opposed to this and I'm just gonna, you'll keep in it longer, I feel like.
Yeah. Oh, that's so helpful. It relates really well to, I wanted to ask you, I heard an interview that you did recently, or maybe not recently, who knows? It could have been a long time ago, where you were talking about kind of the circle that Jesus had in terms of his ability to influence was relatively small and like had to walk places. And it was such a helpful picture for me. I'd love to hear you talk about that picture of Jesus, not only the like kind of the incarnational value, but then what that means for what's valuable in our own work. Because I think people get overwhelmed by the structural issues, but also feel like the only way they can make a difference is to fix something at a really big level or on a really big scale.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. A lot of what affects people's everyday life happens. And you think about things around schools, for example, like the school board does have a lot of power. Like they are allocating the resources that have been given to them. And so you have a part to play in those things, in that allocation, even if you don't have children in public schools. And so I would say, yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes we forget sort of our own limits, like you're one person. And a great thing to do, I always encourage, is to meet other people who have the similar like calling or as you, because you can keep each other going. So it's not like your responsibility, like you yourself are not Jesus Christ, the savior of the world. You're a disciple, and what can you do as a disciple, as someone, and connected to your, I think about even just like Paul, like he went to Ephesus and he spoke. So then the letter we have as Ephesians is really out of this relational experience he has with the church there. And so I think the idea that like I have to do everything I mean, you're living kind of a little bit beyond what it means to actually be a person and a created being. So I think that's really helpful to think about. And I also think, so when I worked for Texas Baptist, my boss, we had to go into this meeting and I was just really nervous because it was going to be a hard issue. And I was just expecting a really hostile conversation. And he kind of was like, let's pray before we go in. And we did. And then we went into the office and the conversation was difficult. But in the end, he asked the staffer that we were meeting with, like, just how are you? Can we pray for you? And him and his wife had just had a baby, so he wasn't sleeping very well. And he was just very stressed with just like his life outside of this office. And so my boss asked if he could pray for him. And I was just like, wait, what? No, like this, it's like one thing to like pray outside the office, but like, whoa, okay. And he was like, yeah, I would love that. And we did. And he maybe like a couple hours later called back and told me, I've talked to the senator and we're going to go with what you guys are saying on this issue. And I never forget that experience because it is not on me, right? Like to remind myself always that this is a work of the Holy Spirit, that God is working in ways that I cannot see and cannot understand, but he has called me to do my part. I think it's really helpful to think about the idea of like an orchestra. Some people just play the violin, right? And it doesn't sort of like Mozart or Bach don't sound, if it's just this, it doesn't sound the same if it's just this one person, or if I'm a violinist and I'm trying to be a cellist, right? Like play your instrument, what God called you to do. And so if that is to be the person that goes to every school board meeting and is always like, hey, what about the kids in Title I schools? And these are the, they don't have the same resources. They don't have the same teachers. I feel like we need to do a tutoring program. Girl, you're playing your instrument and like you're doing what God called you to do. And like, don't feel bad that you don't also march in parades or like, and it just like really like, for me, as I have gotten older and have gone deeper in this work, prayer is like so crucial. It is like the first step. One, God, open my eyes and where are you calling me? What is my part? And I just feel like if more Christians maybe started with that, rather than this, like, I'm exactly like Jesus Christ, so I can save the world. So
we may say that the Bible is God's word, but do we truly believe that it is trustworthy? Historian Susan Lim understands that we may not fully understand the context that formed what we now call the Bible. This can lead to our being suspicious instead of fully trusting in this divinely inspired text. In her book, Light of the Word, Lim recounts how the Bible was assembled and shows through her compelling historical study the trustworthiness of Scripture. Stay tuned until the end of the episode to find out how you can get a 25% discount on Light of the Word at ivpress.com. I so appreciate that, partially because I do think people feel the need to just know a lot and do a lot about everything, and that feels really overwhelming. And also because, we're talking a lot this season about spiritual preparation for an election season. We're trying to move a little bit internally and ask, like, how do we be the kind of people who can do good work without losing our souls, without being warped by the larger, political culture that we're in. And I want to get to that in a minute, but I also want to ask you particularly, if someone is listening to you and thinking, okay, yeah, I think I have figured out my instrument. Like, I think this is the thing I'm supposed to really focus on. How would you counsel them to prepare really practically to engage with that? We'll talk about the spiritual part in a second, but if you're someone who really cares about the quality of public schools, for example, in your community, but you don't know a lot about it and you want to learn about it and advocate for it in a Christian way, how would you counsel someone both kind of educating themselves? Like, how would you counsel them to figure out the best kind of way to seek justice in their community? And then also, how would you counsel them to figure out how to be involved? Because I think some people hear this and go, like, I don't know what to do. I would really like to be involved, but the model I've been given is social media, which has its role, but I don't know what to do beyond that.
Yeah. I always say start with listening. And so some really great places to start with your listening is like local PTAs, going to the school board meeting. I sort of love this model of Be the Bridge, where for 3 months, you're just absorbing.
Mm-hmm.
You can't speak for 3 months. And I think that's so great because I think it's just in our nature that we want to jump in and do something. But I also had another mentor of resist that urge and sort of spend time in getting really quiet and listening. And so if it's education, there's some really great books and that you can read. I would say trying to find other people, if you have friends or family, or there are women in your church or men in your church who are teachers or principals, saying, hey, can I take you to a coffee? And I'm just interested in learning more about this. I'm interested in learning more about public education. I mean, most of us go to church with a ton of teachers, and which is always so funny when people are like, God has left public schools. And it's you don't know how many Christians have dedicated their life to this system, but asking to talk to them. And I think also too, sometimes people get overwhelmed because maybe they do join a group, maybe they get more involved in their PTA and the group is advocating for this one thing. And it seems like all the people that you are listening to, or maybe the people in your church are who have experience, who are knowledgeable, or no, we don't want that thing, we want this other thing. Don't be frightened by that, because there are many ways to eat an apple and you don't have to just kind of go with what you're told. I think part of the listening is you're learning discernment and what makes the most sense, and there's really great organizations. A lot of organizations also have you can read about things. So I would say communities and schools and the Boys and Girls Club also have really great sort of resources about the work that they're doing and what they're seeing and observing in public schools. The Expectations Project is a Christian sort of organization working in public policy. There are more resources than I think most people think. Yeah. And so I would say just maybe pick one area and start with one thing. And maybe you just listen to their podcasts. The New York Times did a really great podcast on public school parents in New York. And that is a tool of learning. So maybe, while you're running, you just kind of listen through that and you find, I think there was a This American Life series about school segregation and how that harms students. And so, don't be afraid to expand sort of the things that podcasts can also be a really great learning resource. And I also think for school board is another, because people run for that. It's an elected office, reaching out to a school board member and being like, hey, I live in your area. Could I come to the office? I'm just interested in learning more about the issues, or like looking at their websites of like, what are their goals for the schools in this area? And, asking to meet with them and talk to them, because again, the way the system works is they wouldn't be in office without people voting for them. And I think for election season, you can read candidates' websites. The League of Women Voters usually has a voter guide in most states and all the way down the ballot that are really helpful. I read newspaper. I mean, I know reading newspapers is like out of style, but I read a lot my local news to know what's going on in my community. They usually do like endorsements because they talk to the candidates, and now it's really great. A lot of newspapers have started posting those interviews online. So going to watch those, and yeah, I think going to a town hall, like if your congressman or school board member is having like a coffee and something, that's a really great way to meet them. Rotary clubs, I mean, not cool for our generation. But you would be surprised how many politicians go through Rotary clubs and go to those breakfasts and like talk. That's their way of talking to the community. They go to the neighborhood associations or Rotary clubs or Lions clubs or other civic institutions. So that's also a really great way to like listen and find out more about what's going on in your community. So those are probably some starter ideas.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I do think part of what I hear you saying too is once you've kind of figured out this is my thing that I'm focusing on, and once you've kind of dealt with the fact that actually maybe locally there's more I can contribute or impact than big national stuff, it does seem less overwhelming then to just kind of go, okay, what I care about is education, or what I care about is housing, and I care about it in this place with these people. And actually, it doesn't take a lot of Googling to like find some meetings that are happening or people that are organizing about it or things that I can read. That feels more manageable. You've kind of mentioned some of this already, but I do think it would be interesting to just hear you talk about your experience in the church and how you have seen, especially, predominantly white churches kind of differ in their political engagement than many Black churches in American history. I'm partially asking this because I do think there are a lot of, as I said earlier, young Christians who have grown up in white evangelical churches and think this is the model of political engagement. I don't like that. So then there's just kind of nothing they feel left with. What do you think they should learn from the history of the Black church in America, especially when it comes to political engagement? Are there particular critiques that would help them kind of move into a healthier way, or would kind of maybe a little bit critique their own apathy in the face of the difficulty that they have seen in the past? Are there things that they need to learn, you think?
Yeah, there's such a rich tradition. I'm like sort of obsessed with that era of American history. So I've read a lot of biographies, but I would say the big thing I would encourage people to take away from that experience is, for pastors or leaders, is part of what it means to care for people is to care for the whole person, the whole circumstance. And that's, part of what you see from like Fred Shuttlesworth, and even with Martin Luther King's father. I'm reading a biography of his father right now. It was really interesting. His church in Atlanta, there was like a strike in the early 1920s or something, 30s in Atlanta, of women who were like washerwomen. And a lot of the women were in his church and felt like, hey, you need to support us because we're being exploited. Like, we're not being paid what our work is worth. And they had to convince and control him. But eventually he did, because he's like, yeah, part of what it means to be a pastor and to shepherd these people is like, I should care about their quality of life, and I should care if they're being exploited when they walk out of the church doors on Sunday. And I would say, there's just like a measure of humility of like, okay, maybe I haven't learned this, or I don't like the model. The first step is saying, I don't like what I have learned. And then thinking about, okay, well, where can I go, or who can I turn to learn from? And I think, there's so many people, I think, in sort of the Black church tradition. I think about, like Fred Shuttlesworth, or like Fannie Lou Hamer, or, like Nanny Helen Burroughs. But I also think, the way in which we tell the Christian story is very exclusionary. So like Jimmy Carter is someone who was a white evangelical who is an excellent model of what it looks like to love Jesus and be involved in public policy. I think people like to cut him out because he was a Democrat. But, you know, and I think about, I can never remember his name, but he helped start Habitat for Humanity. Is it Clarence Jordan? That might be another person. But even within our tradition, you know, you get to pick the stream, right? And so maybe you've come out of a stream that you don't feel like you want to be a part of that anymore. But there are people, faithful Christians throughout time, who have done that. And there's just so much we can learn from them. I think, you know, because of their sacrifices, I mean, we're not facing, you know, the reality of, I think of even someone like Viola Lizzo, who was a white woman who was involved with the March for Voting Rights from Selma to Montgomery. And on the way back, she was driving protesters back and she was killed. And I just think about someone, you know, what does that, like, that sacrifice, like most of us now, in terms of when we're getting involved in political, you know, advocacy or public policy, we're not facing life and death situations. Like, it's not likely that someone is going to shoot you. And so I just think also too, just like the courage of what it means to put yourself, one, in the position of a listener, a humble listener, and then to follow. I think that's also a really hard thing, right? Like, you feel like, okay, I've read all these books, I know everything there is to know about Martin Luther King, like, I should be the leader of this movement. But there is a place for being a really good follower, and like that is important. So much of what Dr. King was able to do was because of people who are in the trenches, like every day showing up to their local courthouse to register to vote or protest inequality. And you know, maybe we don't know their names are lost to history, but God knows their names. And we're all beneficiaries of their sacrifice. And so I think part of it is just, you know, being okay not being the person out front, or if like no one ever knows that you served in this way or did this thing, you know, God is still faithful, and it's about glorifying him. So
sometimes people want to discard part of the legacy they've inherited, maybe just the political party that they were associated with. But the model of like, it's me that has to be the person that like changes the world and gets all the rewards for it, you can keep that part and not realize like you've kept that part. I've even noticed the city that I live in now, Durham, North Carolina, has this really rich history of Black churches' political engagement. And I've noticed that a lot of white students will come to Duke, sometimes the Divinity School, sometimes to some other, you know, school at Duke, and they'll want to get really involved in the political life of Durham. And then they'll get told, okay, show up to this meeting that meets at this Black church. And they like don't know how to deal with the fact that like this came before you. It has all this history. And you really are supposed to just like sit and listen and hear what your marching orders are. That's really difficult for people who feel like, oh, I have a political science degree, I have all this knowledge, like, but it does feel like a spiritual discipline to learn how to do that. And that's one of the big things I want to ask you today is, how do people approach 2024 and maintain healthy relationships with their family and their communities, find a way to advocate for what they believe in without kind of completely disrupting their churches, but maybe disrupting them in a positive way, without, you know, kind of disrupting them in a way that brings greater faithfulness and justice, not in a way that just makes them feel like the prophet flipping tables. How would you counsel people to prepare themselves emotionally, relationally, spiritually for that season, for that difficult work? Maybe they really are listening to you and saying, okay, I want to be involved in a school board. I want to listen. I want to learn. What does it look like for me to think about myself as a whole person, where my spiritual life, my emotional life, my relational life will impact my ability to do that work? How can I prepare well for that?
I've gotten pushback on this, but I'm just going to speak from my experience. You really have to come from a place of love, a deep love of people, and a recognition that this person, despite our disagreements, is created in the image of God. And if I am not in physical danger, or it, you know, maybe sometimes the best way to love people is from afar. So like, absolutely sacrifice. But I think like my experience in my own family is we're kind of like a mixed political family. And I have some relatives that are extremely conservative and totally disagree about some political things. And one thing that always helps me when I enter in those conversations is to remember, like, my aunt in particular makes a wonderful breakfast, and she's so hospitable. And like, I stayed with her one summer. She made me breakfast and lunch every day to like take on my way to class. And like, that's a part of who she is too, even if we don't agree. And so I always think keeping that for me in the forefront of like, again, I think I said at the beginning that like politics is a part of what it means to be, a neighbor, to live in this country, to live in your neighborhood, but it's not the whole of it. I think part of what has happened is politics has become a religion. And so much so that instead of being like, oh, you're wrong on this and I disagree, it's like, you're an evil person and you want me to die. Well, that makes it hard to have any sort of conversation, any kind of civic engagement, when I can't even be in the room with someone who doesn't agree with me politically. And I think that sort of like totalizing, I think there's two, maybe we're dealing with two opposite extremes where we're totalizing politics and making that everything about someone and then just kind of ignoring it and not dealing with it enough. And maybe just like, how are we going to avoid those extremes? I think, making who someone is politically all of who they are makes it hard to have political conversation. It makes it hard to lead. It makes it hard to have a conversation to like change people's minds. If I hate you and think you're evil, like, then a part of me is like, you're not even worth persuading because I think you're an idiot. Like those sorts of attitudes, like you're not going to get very far. And so I think this sort of like, for Christians particularly, one of the things I lament is so much Christians who do get involved in politics looks exactly like people who've never set foot in our church. Like they will lie, they'll cheat, they'll call people names. And it's like, I don't know. I'm not a fan of that. And so I really think in our engagement, part of what it means to be a disciple is like looking like Jesus and loving people. And even for the prophets in Jeremiah, right? Like Jeremiah was a weeping prophet. He had a lot of horrible things to say, but it came out of one, a sense of calling from the Lord, and that he was always praying and asking God, like, what is it you want me to say? And from a deep love of people and just seeing how the evil was destroying them and their life, and leading them down a path of destruction. And so it wasn't just like, hey, I want to get up here and be the leader and have everyone listen to me. It was coming from a place of deep sorrow, a deep burdening by the Lord and for the people. And so I would say, I think it's always important to like take a pause and like, what are my motivations in this conversation, in this relationship? I'm a big fan of, I've talked about, prayer and like, just like for me, like it's more important than I think ever during political seasons to be in church and be in sort of a common worship and fellowship. I think in terms of spiritual disciplines, I think listening is huge. I'm also a big fan of the fruits of the spirit. It's like, am I being kind? Am I being gentle? Am I being joyful? Like, am I being a person of peace and like representing that in how I engage in advocacy and politics? Yeah, because to me, at the end of the day, like my witness as a Christian, as a follower of Christ is like the most important thing. Even if I never see on this side of eternity, equal funding in public schools, I want to be, when I get to heaven, the person who sang my part or played my instrument in the orchestra, but in a way that brought glory to God. Like that is the most important thing. And like, just, I think not losing sight of like the ultimate, like this world is not our home. I think sometimes people use that as a tool to hide. But I hope that it's coming across in that it's not a tool to not do anything and not get engaged, but it also is like your ultimate hope is Jesus Christ and the fulfillment of in heaven at the end of times. And that's when all things will be made perfect. Like part of living in a fallen world is things are not perfect. And so that being sort of also to the motivator of like, this doesn't all depend on me. I don't have to resolve all of these issues, because honestly, they won't be resolved until new heaven and new earth. And so I think those are good things to like keep in the forefront of your mind as you're preparing for what is already looking to be a really difficult season. Another practical thing, this was the last thing I'll say, as part of this is a spiritual practice, it's so helpful for me, is when you're having those sort of one-on-one conversations and you feel like it's like listening or seeking to understand. So I ask a lot of questions. Like in dialoguing with people that maybe have different political beliefs, or maybe they or just saying what they maybe saw on TV or, sharing an experience, to be like, oh, okay, so what I hear you saying is this. Why do you feel this way? Or what is it about that incident that speaks to the larger sort of political thing? Like, why do you think that people would do X, Y, and Z? Because it kind of turns the temperature down. And then it's like a really good practice in terms of listening and being humble of like, oh, I can learn something too. Like, I'm not just seeking to educate, I'm also seeking to be educated.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I just recently, and I don't think I've said this yet in any of the interviews that we've done, but I just recently was watching a conversation between two people that was getting kind of heated on a sort of political issues about how our communities function well and how children should be cared for in our communities. And it was getting kind of heated. And the one person said to the other person who was kind of escalating the conversation, "Thank you so much for caring so deeply about the children in our community." And it totally lowered the temperature because it was so disarming. The other person it was genuine. It was not a tactic. It wasn't a strategy. It was like the other person could tell, you really do care about this and you are thankful that I care about this. And that is so not the normal pattern of the conversations that we've been modeled that I don't even know how to respond for a moment in a way that's good, in a way that's not like, oh, you didn't just catch them off guard. You really did change the conversation. It felt personal. It felt like there was some common ground. And even just the pause can like help the conversation not feel so tense of like, oh, Kathryn just asked me a question. I wasn't prepared for that. I thought she would respond with like, another take against me. Even that is like stopping us from escalating. That's so helpful. Thank you for giving us some practical tools for that. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for the work that you do and for, giving us your wisdom today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun.
The Disruptors is a production of InterVarsity Press. For more information on any IVP titles mentioned on this episode, visit ivpress.com and use code IVPOD25. That's IVPOD25 for 25% off. Sound engineering by Honest Podcasts. Our producers are Andrew Bronson, Mila Kim, Helen Lee, and Travis Albritton. Our production assistant is Isis Toldson. And I'm your host, Kaitlyn Schiess. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the IVP YouTube channel, and leave a rating and review to support the podcast.